more of a talk around this idea of superpowers. This is about really appreciating all that, that someone may have sort of become as a person in how they've been shaped by the trauma, not just being defined by, the flashbacks, the dysregulation, the PTSD, but that appreciation that the way that trauma survivors may be different due to how they've had to create sort of distinctive ways to cope and survive following the trauma, and how this has led to some real sort of exceptional and extraordinary abilities.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Lead podcast with me, Amy Orr-Ewing, and today I'm absolutely delighted to welcome my dear friend and someone I admire greatly, Heather Joy. Heather is a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist and EMDR therapist. We will find out what those things mean as we go through the podcast. Following her studies in psychology, she has worked in the NHS. For those of you watching from around the world, that is the National Health Service in Britain. And she's worked there for 15 years in both mental and physical health services in Birmingham and London. She's led in adapting and delivering psychological interventions for people with long-term physical health conditions, and most recently, long COVID. Heather developed an interest in trauma and PTSD following working with traumatized refugee populations. She now runs a private practice doing psychological therapy for adults experiencing a wide range of mental health concerns. And Heather lives very close to me, even though we're doing this on Riverside, with her husband and two wonderful children and their gorgeous black Labrador Hector, who I absolutely adore as well. Welcome to the Lead podcast, Heather. It's so wonderful to have you on.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, so Heather, I don't know whether you remember this, but I certainly remember a walk we went on in one of the darkest seasons of life for me. And we'd been friends before that and obviously been in church together, but you were there for me in a very special way. And that was the point in my life when I was beginning to understand something about trauma as I read up on what I was experiencing. But this is your profession, and I know you're absolutely brilliant at it. Can you begin by describing for our listeners your career path? How did you find your way into the work that you do?
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Well, having studied psychology at school and being very interested in it, I went on to study it at university. I had a natural interest in understanding people and wanted to use that knowledge to help people and to relieve suffering. I suppose that was my main sort of motivator. So I did postgraduate studies in health psychology and was drawn to the role of psychology in actually managing chronic illness. Because I was sort of really fascinated by the link between the mind and the body, and therefore the opportunity to use that to help people and relieve suffering. So my early career sort of actually getting involved in sort of designing and implementing sort of a lot of health promotion initiatives in sort of inner city populations at risk of sort of chronic diseases, sort of what we know as the sort of deadly trio of heart disease, kidney disease, and diabetes. And this is what took me to inner city Birmingham, which, as I know you have connections with.
Yes, I grew up there, so it's so interesting.
Yeah. So I had actually, it was quite a colourful time. When I was there, I had fun sort of touring on health buses and running groups in mosques and churches and temples and community centres, very much in and amongst the communities. But from there, I decided I wanted to do more sort of formal psychotherapy training due to the high rates of mental illness that, I was seeing amongst the communities that I was working with there in Birmingham. We know that people who are survivors of trauma and have had adverse childhood experiences have higher rates of chronic illness, which is thought to be due to the impact on the nervous system and brain development. So it was something I really wanted to sort of explore further. So I was fortunate to be given the opportunity to do my psychotherapy training alongside working in a mental health service in the NHS. So my primary training was in sort of cognitive behavioural therapy. And then I remained in sort of adult mental health services in the NHS, where I gained experience working with a sort of a broad range of common mental health difficulties. But in the last few years, as you say, I've focused more on my private practice, and I work mostly out of a wonderful farm surrounded by the sheep and the donkeys.
We both know well.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And then I've sort of since developed, trained in other models of therapy, including sort of EMDR and compassion-focused therapy. So, yeah, that's what sort of brings me to where I'm at now.
So on this podcast, I interview or have conversations with women of faith, Christian women who have callings into all kinds of careers and spheres of life that are very much the front line. And it just strikes me as I'm listening to you that compassion, that attentiveness to human suffering, that desire to sort of show up on the front lines as something very beautiful from a faith perspective. But I imagine that there have been challenges along the way. And sometimes, when we're young, we kind of look ahead at calling and career, and we have great dreams of alleviating suffering or, whatever it is that God's calling us into. On this podcast, we've had bankers and politicians, others as well. But it's not always easy, is it? Actually showing up to meet need and stepping into your career and calling. So what can you share with us what some of the challenges have been that you've faced in your career and how you've handled them?
Yeah. Thanks, Amy. So I particularly remember a time when I was working a lot with severely traumatized asylum seekers, which included the victims of torture and human trafficking, and feeling very helpless. Just due to the level of suffering and need, their needs were so complex and just seemed so much greater than sort of we could help with the resources that we had at the time. And coupled with that, sort of getting my head around all the evil in the world, I just remember that was really challenging. So I did a lot of sort of processing that sort of emotion privately, crying out to God in prayer, lifting all the pain and suffering up. And then in the workplace, despite having sort of quite limited resources in the service that I worked in for such complex needs, I reached out and sought sort of more specialist supervision from my consultant clinical psychologist from the London sort of forced migration trauma service, who could then sort of mentor me and help me working with this group. I mean, all sort of counsellors, therapists, psychologists have regular supervision, but I sought this sort of additionally to my standard supervision, is to get that mentoring. And then I also sort of linked in with lots of, specialist services, local organisations supporting this group. So like the National sort of Freedom from Torture organisation, and then local sort of support groups. But I took a great interest in trying to really understand the challenges that they faced, like the whole process of asylum in this country and the system, as well as more around the context of the countries that they came from. So I think I really learned that despite that sort of initial just of helplessness, I learned that you can be aware of your own limitations, but whilst not underestimating the role that you can play in sort of helping and making a difference in some way. So for them, having someone really understanding their plight and showing that warmth and compassion when they sort of been so harmed at the hands of others, could have really been the start of their healing journey. So the first part of that jigsaw puzzle. I think that really stands out to me.
Yeah, well, that stands out to me, that theme of seeking mentorship, seeking, additional growth. Like, it's not a passive thing. You don't just show up at some point in your life as, highly able or whatever it is God just called you to do. There are steps and there's work and there's unpaid work. I mean, work around the edges of what God's called you to do. And the other thing that strikes me there as well from what you say is curiosity of, people who are excellent at what they do are often really curious and want to grow and want to listen. That's really interesting. So you work as a psychotherapist, and just to be clear, you have not been my clinician or my husband's, because we're friends, right? You can't necessarily treat people that you're connected to in that sort of way. But can you share a little bit with our listeners about what trauma is, as opposed to difficulty or discomfort? At the moment, I've got 3 teenagers, and you can sort of, the word trauma has kind of entered the common vocab, hasn't it? It's like, oh, this happened and it was traumatic, and it was like not traumatic. And then I guess there are other people, I think, maybe not who are listening to this, but maybe connected to some who are listening to this, who sort of think we're all a bit over the top about trauma and previous generations just kind of got on with it. Can you share a bit about what trauma is for us, so that we can kind of grasp this isn't just a bit of discomfort, this is something more?
Absolutely. So as you say, as opposed to kind of difficulty, discomfort, stress, there's a spectrum of experiences that can potentially be traumatizing, including so things like accidents, assaults, natural disasters, which we might call kind of shock traumas, often single incidents. Then we have sort of another category, which is more in the realm of sort of developmental or relational trauma. So things like chronic adversity, childhood abuse, neglect, lack of safety. And then other experiences like chronic toxic stress, medical procedures, adverse kind of community environments like poverty, discrimination, and violence. But the sorts of events which traumatize people are normally sort of out of their control. And it's when someone's been exposed to sort of actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. But I think the really important thing to understand is that, and you really highlight this in your book, Amy, which is really super helpful, is that trauma is an experience. It's not an event. It's a result of what happens inside of us as a result of what happened to us. So it's the response to the threat rather than the event itself.
Fascinating. And can you describe what that could look like? What happens inside of us? What are some of the common trauma responses in the human person?
So I think this links to sort of understanding sort of the that sort of fight flight response in us. Most people have sort of heard of the fight or flight response, our built-in survival mechanism to protect us from harm, our ability to respond to a threatening, sort of dangerous situation by preparing our bodies for action to either sort of fight or run away. There are automatic responses to an event which is sort of perceived as stressful or threatening, designed to kind of increase our chance of survival in threatening situations. So the body prepares us for physical activity by activating that sympathetic nervous system, which releases adrenaline, and then kind of leads to all those physical changes, the heart rate increasing, breathing increasing, and tense our muscles ready to fight. However, many individuals who've survived trauma may have experienced other kind of automatic physiological and behavioural responses during their trauma, including freezing, which is also sort of dissociation, and what we call sort of appeasement or fawn. So we've got these four sort of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And I think it's really helpful to understand those different responses in us, and why we may experience that at the time, and then sort of why we also might then sort of be a bit stuck in some of these responses after the trauma. But freeze might be a helpful response, sort of, to a trauma in the early stages, as a way of giving time to sort of evaluate a situation or make it less noticeable. But then later on, we may go into sort of more of this shutdown, and actually called dissociate, as it may be helpful if it's not possible to escape or win, then becoming kind of unresponsive might be the best chance of survival. And this might feel like a sort of an out-of-body experience, kind of feeling quite separate from what's happening, emotions just becoming numb, not feeling pain, and being unable to move, that sort of being frozen. So that's the freeze. The fawn, or the sort of appease, if the threat is another person. So in the trauma, if the threat is another person, then sort of giving them what they want, placating them, begging or submitting, could reduce the danger. And this would look like sort of perhaps adopting a submissive body posture. But I think it is helpful to understand those kind of, automatic responses, and understanding our nervous system, but understanding trauma and our reaction to stress. So, being exposed to chronic stress or to traumatic experiences can then lead to sort of nervous system kind of dysregulation, and where we get kind of stuck in those survival responses. So it can lead to kind of an overactive sort of alarm system, if you think it's like a threat detection system. And the brain, after a trauma, if we don't sort of naturally kind of process that, then the brain can then, it gets a bit stuck in this dysregulated system. It can fail to distinguish between sort of real threats and imagined threats. So even the thought about something bad happening can trigger that sort of these fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses, which are so automatic.
That's so interesting, Heather, because it's one thing, isn't it? And I think a lot of people listening to this, I mean, if you've listened to the 2 episodes with Orr-Ewing, my husband, we talked a little bit with him as a survivor, exploring some of that. But I know for me, like even learning about freeze and fawn was so helpful, because it just, I think I did probably know about fight or flight, but often you look back on your own reaction and you kind of castigate yourself. Why didn't I get myself out of the situation? And actually to know this is physiological, this is psychological, this is deeply human survival reaction to, it's a legitimate, normal reaction to, the terrifying thing that's occurring. So there'll be some people listening to this who are, leading and navigating teams, for example, and they may have people on their teams who are, so I just want to draw out what you were saying about getting stuck. So, they can't see in front of them a person experiencing a trauma, but the person may be exhibiting, I don't know, dissociation or some other trauma response in a team context. But without the background and context as a leader, you don't necessarily understand what's happening. Can you talk a bit about, just for lay people, not people who are going to be therapists or who are not going to be responsible for the mental health ultimately of that person, but can you help leaders with what it means when a trauma response is happening, disconnected from the original trauma ostensibly? So, it's just happening in the course of a meeting or whatever. So maybe you mentioned dissociation, but any others that you can think of that might be helpful for us to be aware of so we can lead our teams well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that was a lot of trauma responses, aren't necessarily visible. So you may not realize that someone's having a flashback in the middle of a meeting, or they're walking around in a very high level of anxiety and feeling incredibly on edge. But you may notice more kind of behavioral responses, such as finding it hard to trust or delegate to others. And so then sort of integrating, they might go through a time where it's really hard for them to kind of integrate into a team, just that general kind of, I suppose, finding it hard to kind of be around others. And it might seem like, someone's kind of withdrawing, or just not wanting to be around people, isolating themselves. But that is, as part of perhaps what, the trauma response and what they're sort of dealing with or trying to kind of process. Difficulties in concentration because of the kind of raised state of kind of anxiety that can affect concentration. So, that could lead to kind of inconsistencies in work output. So kind of, productivity going up and down. So, these are a kind of variety of things. And going back to the sort of dissociation, actually, someone appearing very distant, sort of closed off, not interested, may be a type of dissociation. So, a flashback is one form of this, where sort of they unwantedly tuning into sort of unwanted memories, reminders of their trauma. So a trigger brings back the memory in the mind, which could just be an image, or a smell, or a sound, a taste, or a body feeling. But for them, it feels like it's happening right then, right there, like they're back at the time. And then sort of another form of a dissociation is sort of where they're actually just tuning out. So, when someone feels quite separate or detached from themselves, which we call sort of depersonalization, or separate and detached from the world, which we call sort of derealization. I mean, these episodes can be brief, but for some people they can be recurrent and chronic, especially if it was very sort of severe trauma or multiple trauma. These are more common sort of responses. And I think another one, which perhaps is very common, that again is quite misunderstood, is just sort of a general sense of feeling quite low and negative and sort of feeling quite sort of hopeless about the future, because of perhaps just how someone may be just trying to get their head around actually what's happened to them, and that nothing sort of feels the same as it was, if it was quite a recent trauma, or the world's not as they once knew it, or all the kind of sort of negative thoughts that might be coming up as a result of the trauma. So a belief that they're inadequate for not coping with the trauma differently, or thinking they're weak for not having got over it quick enough. These sort of things could really be affecting sort of their everyday state of mind. So I think trauma survivors, particularly if they have PTSD, that's post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD, will have this underlying, ongoing sense of kind of current threat. Their nervous system is keeping them prepared and ready for the danger around the next corner. After a trauma, your brain is programmed to sort of stay on the lookout, just in case, there's more that could hurt you. So this is kind of what trauma therapy, the work of trauma therapy tries to do, and why it could be so helpful to get, that therapy. It tries to help update and process those trauma memories so that it can be sort of integrated into more sort of the sort of general memory system. So those memories are kind of put back into the context of time and place, so that we have that sense of like, that was then and this is now. And also therapy can help to kind of address any of those difficult beliefs or meanings that formed as a result of the trauma, like I was mentioning, due to sort of, unfair self-blame, or thinking they could have done more to stop it, or thinking they could have acted sooner. These are all the sort of things that the therapy can help with.
That's just so wonderful. So, at least a part of what you could do as a leader who had any compassion would be hang in there with people, I guess. Encourage anyone that needs therapy to get it and seek it. I've definitely found as a Christian leader, just being open about that I needed that sort of help and intervention. So you're kind of modeling, encouraging people to that you're not going to be written off somehow, that if you go there, if you're honest about this, if you seek the help, that it might end up being disastrous for you. On the totally opposite is true. Can I ask you to talk for a moment about what some people call the superpowers that can come with trauma survivors? So people talk about extraordinary resilience and almost kind of super skills that do seem to accompany some people who have survived horror. Could you talk about that a bit?
Definitely. And again, in your book, Amy, you mentioned this term sort of post-traumatic growth. And there's been a lot of research on post-traumatic growth, that sort of positive growth or change that can come from going through the trauma. For example, new ways of thinking, having a renewed appreciation of life, or developing deeper relationships that you journeyed with through it, or spiritual growth, these sorts of things. And that's, post-traumatic growth is different to resilience, because it's which is more of that ability to kind of return to how you were before the trauma. It's kind of this actual kind of change, this growth. But now you mentioned superpowers. Now there's this kind of more of a talk around this idea of superpowers. And I think this is about really appreciating all that that someone may have sort of become as a person, in how they've been shaped by the trauma, not just being defined by the flashbacks, the dysregulation, the PTSD, but that appreciation that of the way that trauma survivors may be different due to how they've had to create sort of distinctive ways to cope and survive following the trauma. and how this has led to some real sort of exceptional and extraordinary abilities. So some of the sort of superpowers that have been sort of that people have identified as things like having really strong intuitive and empathic abilities, sort of sensitivity and deep resonance with things like nature, animals, art, poetry, being able to juggle multiple things at the same time, sort of quite unyielding, sort of boundary setting. That's how they've really had to adapt. And another big one is kind of truth telling and truth detection. And I know that
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Truth telling, and say that again, Heather. I missed
truth telling and truth detection.
Wow.
Yeah. But just from my experience, I know that the trauma survivors I've met have demonstrate an incredible feat of just sheer will, strength, and courage to sort of navigate their lives and relationships out of the horror that they've endured. So I think it is helpful to think about actually, well, how is someone sort of adapted and how is that kind of just formed them perhaps in those ways that can be exceptional, as well as obviously the struggle and the difficulties.
Do you see something of the redemption story in the work that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. I have the privilege of seeing people being able to face their past trauma and navigate the path of healing from that trauma, which is often then led to profound insights and new perspectives on life. So that kind of as we were talking about the post-traumatic growth, through suffering and challenges, I see people sort of discovering that they can sort of leave situations that aren't right for them in work or relationships, learning to speak up for themselves or others, coping with challenges that they didn't think they were capable of handling. People who've been abused, developing a new relationship with their bodies, whereby they feel sort of empowered in ways that they've never felt before. So that sense of, I think, seeing people find hope again when they've come from the darkest places in their lives is redemption, right there. And the capacity of
would you say that sort of that transformation, that healing journey has a physiological impact? Because you were talking about the connection between trauma and chronic health, but is there a connection between healing of memories and that sort of thing and like what happens with the actual brain, not just the mind, and what happens with the nervous system?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because as that sort of healing takes place, then actually as those memories are processed in and put in sort of context of time and place, actually then the nervous system kind of is caught up with that, actually. So we haven't got such a kind of oversensitive alarm system, so we're less likely to react, get those false alarms, get such rushes of anxiety or sort of something just kind of taking us by surprise, taking us back to something, actually, because we're kind of we've got that sort of, our regulation system is a bit more in check. We're actually able to kind of distinguish between, well, what's a threat and what isn't a threat, and actually, okay, I'm here in this situation now, so someone's telling me that sort of critiquing my work, this doesn't necessarily lead to such a kind of isn't such a trigger and bring up all those kind of same thoughts and feelings like we may have felt at the time. We can kind of distinguish between sort of then and now and have that more accurate reading.
Appraisal.
Amazing. Exactly.
So that's a deep connection then with the Christian redemption story, which centers around a body, a human body in history, the body of Jesus, the body of God incarnate. And the theme of the resurrection, not as a spiritual resurrection, as a physical resurrection. You got me thinking on a new train of thought, Heather. More to come on that.
That's something to draw out. Absolutely.
Sounds like something to draw out and reflect on. So lots of people listening to this are leading in different spheres, women leading in, education, the law, finance, all kinds of fascinating careers in the arts. Could you share with us some sort of simple practical tools for leaders when we feel a bit overwhelmed? So I'm not talking about, we've experienced a catastrophic trauma. Obviously, people may well need to see a therapist themselves and seek specific help. But what about when we feel overwhelmed? How do you manage your own system when you feel overload is coming? Can you share some tips with us?
Yeah, sure. And recently there's been a sort of a rise in interest in bringing sort of compassion-focused practices to the workplace in order to sort of improve team functioning and well-being. So I sort of tried to apply some of this to myself. But compassionate resilience, I suppose, to try and share in a nutshell, it's a big topic, but it's really to kind of be real and recognize and engage with sort of any suffering, so any difficulty that we may be experiencing, and then to be motivated to sort of alleviate the suffering, to help ourselves. So this might look like just getting better at noticing our overloaded systems and noticing when we're a little bit out of just feeling something. So noticing that we're in that threat mode, we're stressed, maybe our heart rate's just going a bit faster, we're feeling a bit more on edge, maybe our digestive system's out of whack, and how when we're stressed we might be more likely to be thinking negatively, sort of fearing the worst, or personalizing situations, or jumping to conclusions, being quite self-critical, and sort of just trying to kind of notice that any narratives that are kind of you're telling yourself that, gosh, just this, I'm kind of not cut out for this, or everyone's more capable than me, and then sort of from that place of just attending and noticing, allowing ourselves to take a bit of a step back and allow ourselves to kind of to calm by, again, coming to the body, actively engaging that parasympathetic nervous system, a relaxation response. And that might be sort of taking some deep breaths, doing something to actively sort of self-soothe and connect with feelings of sort of calm. This can really, again, it comes back to the nervous system, this can really help counter the tendencies to get stuck in that sort of threat mode when our systems are overloaded. So just sort of daily habits as well. If we know that we're going through a period of high stress at work, just little daily habits such as kind of grounding and centering ourselves at the beginning of the day can be so useful, just by simple mindful awareness, like starting your morning routine, just purely attending through your senses by enjoying the smell of your coffee, enjoying the feeling of the warmth on your skin during your morning shower, rather than letting your mind just be all over the place from the moment you wake up. And this can put us in a better place also for the day to kind of engage that more compassionate mind, to be able to bring in those compassionate perspectives to ourselves and situations, as opposed to perhaps self-attacking or getting highly defensive or withdrawing. So I think there's something there around that sort of compassion, to that self-care, to attend to ourselves, which is so important as leaders, and when probably we are dealing with a lot of need, a lot of other people's needs, and working at sort of a very high capacity. But I think generally, finding your outlet, finding the thing for you that helps, kind of gives you that sort of release. For me, it's exercise. It helps release a lot of tension in my body.
Sidebar,
and grounds
Heather
me.
is a champion squash player. So I'll just say that again. Sidebar, Heather is a champion squash player who competes at national competition level. So yeah, that's just so helpful about exercise. I feel like that isn't something I attended to very much when I had younger children. But now I do Pilates, reformer Pilates, a few times a week, and it's just made the most enormous difference to my overall health, I think. It's interesting, isn't it, that the Bible talks about meditating on the word day and night, and that having something positive and true and good and beautiful to chew over mentally, to meditate on, or to start our day in the scriptures can be a really beautiful thing.
Absolutely.
If someone watching this or listening to this begins to feel that actually they might need to address their personal mental health as a leader, more than these sort of simple practices that are available to us of self-regulation and deeper breathing and the things that you've mentioned, if someone needed more, how could they go about finding and getting that support?
I think speaking to your GP can be a good place to start if you're just not sure about what kind of support you need, and perhaps kind of identifying a GP that's kind of well versed in mental health, so that they can help identify what kind of support you need and what your options are. Sometimes employers have kind of employee assist programs, which is another avenue to explore. Whether you can access counselling or therapy, or whether it's more of a kind of multidisciplinary approach of mental health specialists like psychiatrists and psychologists, and occupational health obviously can offer kind of tailored advice as well. But I think it can be really tricky navigating what kind of help and with who. So I think just getting that sort of advice, first of all, doing that research to find out, well, what do I need? And that there's obviously via the NHS there's access to kind of talking therapies, and sort of privately going through sort of professional bodies, counselling, sort of accredited counsellors, therapists. There's those official kind of ways of finding therapists, and finding who might sort of be able to help. So I think it can be tricky to navigate sort of who and what help I need, but that's a really important step, obviously, to get that advice.
Thank you. Okay, well, I've got 2 more questions for you. One is, in my book, Lead Like the Real You, I talk about imposter syndrome, and it's so interesting to me how so many women identify with this, and it almost seems like, the more kind of successful women are, the more you hear sort of under the breath, yeah, that was me. I definitely have experienced imposter syndrome. So can you explain to us what that is and why so many people and so many women in particular experience it, including senior and high capacity leaders?
Yeah. So imposter syndrome, it's that sort of fear of being found out, sort of a fraud, that sense of being a fraud. And it's thought to comprise of sort of three main tendencies. This is what sort of has been researched. Sort of to think that other people have an inflated sort of perception of our abilities. Secondly, to fear that our true abilities will at some point be uncovered, that will be sort of found out. And then thirdly, to attribute success to luck or other factors. So I think in simple terms, imposter syndrome is the disconnect between your experience, or so the disconnect you experience between how others see you and how you see yourself. It's that doubt of our ability rather than the lack of it. And those feelings of sort of inadequacy typically exist despite lots of evidence to the contrary that you're indeed capable, as you say. This is kind of experienced by very high capacity leaders. But interesting research has shown that feelings are particularly likely to strike when a person starts a new job or takes on new responsibilities. So ironically, the feeling that one is a fraud can inspire almost greater effort and conscientiousness, sort of thus leading to more success and promotion, therefore triggering another round of imposter feelings. Which is perhaps why it's often felt by high capacity, high achieving leaders. It perpetuates that cycle of always needing to do more, of achieving more,
work
harder, exactly. Which is why it's often found sort of there's a big relationship with kind of perfectionists and those perfectionist tendencies. But there's obviously there's lots of sort of background to this, and the theory that that perhaps more sort of traditional societal expectations about gender roles, sort of women being homemakers or caring roles, can exacerbate the situation as well. So a woman might be less likely to credit her career success on her own merit and rather sort of due to other factors. To be kind of more consistent with those cultural norms around sort of femininity. So, just thinking about why this is why for women in particular. But I think, impossible, kind of quite, unrelenting kind of impossible expectations from ourselves and others can really, play a role. So, women nowadays women can feel this pressure to do it all, to kind of to be able to have a successful career, to be the best mum. What research has shown that working women still feel the weight of a responsibility more than men. So this can really set us up to sort of almost, it can set us up to fail, and actually feel inadequate, not good enough. It's that sort of perfectionist sort of trap that the expectation has to be perfect, whereas actually it's kind of really an unrealistic kind of expectation that we're putting on ourselves. So I think there's lots of interesting influences, and I think comparison culture, with social media, we put this sort of filtered version of reality. There's this constant sort of strive to kind of do more, achieve more, rather than making sort of choices that actually are sort of best for us. So, I think there's a lot there's a lot of influences there. And obviously men can, very much experience this as well. But it's, thinking, also, those sort of very kind of particular pressures, I think that, often are shaped by society and, and organizations as well. So it's a big, as you say, it comes up a lot in therapy and often in sort of very high achieving individuals, for sure.
Well, thank you, Heather. So my last question is, if you could, and I ask this, by the way, to everyone who comes on the podcast.
Right, yeah.
So no pressure.
Yeah.
And anyway, if you could say one thing to your younger self to give her some advice or encouragement or wisdom, what would it be?
Well, quite sort of simple. But I think be more sort of who you are and less of what you think people expect you to be. I think just appreciating sort of all that, God's actually made me to be, be made to be me for a reason. And you can be used for good, whatever place that you're in. So I think less of a kind of sense of striving and more just kind of being, focusing on what I am in the image of God rather than sort of what I'm not. And it comes back to that sort of comparison quite often. But I think, that for me, I think would be a biggie.
Amazing. Heather Joy, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your hard-won wisdom and just extraordinary empathy. And I'm sure the listeners can hear from your tone, that calling to healing that you have, which is just so powerful.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks for having me.
Well, not at all. And thank you so much to our listeners for listening. If you are enjoying the podcast, can I ask you to do us the huge favour of leaving us a 5-star review and following the show? These small things make a huge difference and help other people find the content. Thank you for listening to the Lead Podcast with me, Amy Orr-Ewing. Please join us next week for another conversation.